Discover the captivating secrets of the House of Savoy in our latest YouTube video. Originating in 1003 with Humbert the Fiend white-handed, this Alpine dynasty rose from humble counts to rulers of the Duchy of Savoy, Kingdom of Sicily, Kingdom of Sardinia, and ultimately the Kingdom of Italy, 1861 to 1946. With a fortune estimated at $300 to $500 million, built on strategic estates and trade routes, the Savoys shaped European history. Key figures like Victor Amadeus II and Victor Emmanuel II drove Italian unification, yet their legacy is shrouded in mystery. Secret pacts, scandalous affairs, and controversial fascist ties rival the intrigue of the Borgias and Romanovs. From their UNESCO-listed Turin residences to their enduring dynastic influence, the Savoy's story blends opulence with enigma. Join us as we unravel the hidden truths behind one of Europe's most powerful families, whose legacy echoes the grandeur of the Bourbons and the resilience of the Grosvenors. Subscribe and dive into this historical journey. From new money to old money, picture the echo of iron shoes on a stone road that winds through the top of Europe, a dizzying ribbon suspended between sky-blue glaciers and the black mouths of tunnels carved by men who feared no avalanche. That sound, hooves creaking cartwheels, the jangle of mail on a mounted guard, was money in motion 1,000 years ago, and Humbert I of Maurienne, the legendary founder of the House of Savoy, heard it long before the rest of Christendom caught on. He was not born an aristocrat of endless vineyards and soft river valleys. He was, in the blunt modern sense, a frontier entrepreneur who staked his claim on brutal mountain passes: Mont Cenis, Great Saint Bernard, Little Saint Bernard, Grimsel, Simplon, the icy choke points that knit Italy to France, Germany, and beyond. Every pack horse that clopped past his toll house paid for the privilege of survival. That is why contemporary historians sometimes call Humbert's fortune new money. The medieval cousin of William and Mary Brickell, turning a mosquito-ridden patch of Florida scrub into Miami real estate gold 9 centuries later. Both fortunes were forged where ordinary people saw only hardship and swampland, or in Humbert's case, walls of ice. By the mid-11th century, Humbert's descendants controlled more than the airless throats of alpine ravines. They had sheriffs, viscounts, and castellans on every ledge and saddle, a pilgrim on the road to Rome, a papal courier racing north, a caravan hauling Flemish cloth to Genoa, all had to slide a coin onto a Savoyard palm. The family's parchment archive still preserves grim little receipts for 3 denarii, 5 denarii, small numbers that added up century after century to the mountainous equivalent of a Brickell land bank. Medieval chroniclers muttered that the Counts of Savoy were obsessed with customs revenues. Modern economic historian Robert Bartlett confirmed the gossip in his 2022 Oxford lecture. No other princely house in Europe monetized geography with quite the same cold-eyed persistence. Alpine tolls were their first love, wool their second. Even before England's Cloth Acts, Savoyard agents quietly nudged Flemish weavers toward Piedmontese villages, offering cheap watermills and lighter taxes. A German travel diary from 1384 teased the counts for thinking more of spinning wheels than of lances. And yet, if you fast forward to the age of powdered wigs and sonatas, an age when real old money meant a landed crown, the Savoys had somehow risen from toll-keepers to kings. The hinge moment came in 1713 at the close of the War of the Spanish Succession, when Victor Amadeus II marched into Palermo's sun-blasted cathedral, placed his hand on a beaten gold gospel, and heard the papal legate proclaim him King of Sicily. Sicily was a prize that made the Habsburgs nervous, the Bourbons jealous, and the Vatican momentarily grateful. Cambridge, political historian Lucy Rial calls it one of the canniest flips in European diplomacy, because Victor Amadeus had switched alliances twice in 12 years, siding first with France, then with Austria, then drifting back toward France to ensure he'd come out of the meat grinder with a crown. Picture a casino player sliding his chips from red to black and back again, always in time with the croupier's spin. The upgrade from comital boots to royal silk stockings was more than a new title. It required a whole new performance of legitimacy, which is why Turin erupted in Baroque magnificence almost overnight. The Regia di Venaria Reale, often dubbed the Versailles of Piedmont, sprawled over 950 rooms with frescoed hunting scenes, mirrored galleries, and gardens so vast they consumed 3 villages. Italian architect Amedeo di Castellamonte supervised the first phase, but it was Filippo Juvara, late of Rome, who gave the complex its famous Diana Gallery, columns like bundled reeds flaring into gold leaf cornices, a sight that makes curators at New York's Whitney Museum wince with architectural envy today. UNESCO placed the Hunting Lodge and 10 other Savoy residences on its World Heritage List in 1997, praising them as a serial masterclass in royal self-advertisement. Even the Savoy family's enemies, and they had many, admitted the dynasty could stage a tableau. But limestone and stucco alone would not seal their seat among Europe's old money clans. Marriages would. Victor Amadeus II married a Bourbon princess, Anne Marie d'Orléans, niece to Louis XIV, binding Turin to Versailles. Their son, Charles Emmanuel III, secured an Austrian archduchess. Their daughters scattered into the houses of Bourbon-Parma, Habsburg-Lorraine, and even into the fractured cadet branches of Valois. A 2019 study published in the journal Historical Network Analysis mapped Savoy marriage ties and discovered they ranked 6th in intermarriages with reigning houses, just behind the Hohenzollerns. In contemporary language, think Aristotle Onassis mingling with Niarchos and Kennedy elites, except the Savoys did it for 500 straight years. Their ascent also rode the pistons of Piedmontese industry. Long before Fiat rolled its first car off the Lingotto ramp in 1912, Savoy princes subsidized proto-industrial foundries along the Dora Riparia River, smelting cannon barrels for Austrian campaigns. By the 1840s, Count Camillo di Cavour, later architect of Italian unification, was lobbying Victor Emmanuel II to blanket Piedmont with rail lines the way Vanderbilt blankets New York with steamships, as he put it in one letter. Control of Alpine transit evolved from mule caravans to iron locomotives. The Frejus rail tunnel opened in 1871, shaving 12 hours off the Paris-Turin route and funneling new customs fees into the royal purse. A 2020 Bloomberg retrospective on European infrastructure profit schemes named the Savoys, perhaps the only dynasty to monetize the same mountain twice, first with toll gates, then with rail tickets. Yet legitimacy, once gained, can be squandered. In 1922, King Victor Emmanuel III, great-grandson of the unifier, invited Benito Mussolini to form a government rather than order the army to disperse fascist black shirts massing outside Rome. The decision looked savvy in the short term, catastrophic later. When the Allies landed in Sicily in 1943 and Mussolini crumbled, the king's earlier complicity doomed his prestige. Historian Dennis Mack Smith bluntly wrote in the New York Review of Books that Victor Emmanuel bought himself 50 fascist bayonets at the cost of the crown's soul. That stain, like California oilman Edward Doheny's Teapot Dome disgrace, never washed out. After Italy voted yes to a republic in the 1946 referendum, 12.7 million in favor, 10.7 million against. The dynasty was exiled, and its male line banned from setting foot on Italian soil for 57 years. The Savoys watched the coronation of Queen Elizabeth II on a scratchy London television set. Guests of Earl Mountbatten, and reportedly stood during God Save the Queen with tears creeping into their coffee cups. What, then, of the treasure they left behind? Let's count. The royal palace of Turin, with its Chinese porcelain cabinets and sword of San Maurizio, said to have pierced a dragon, became state property overnight. The Regia di Venaria Reale languished as a NATO barracks, its stucco cracked by truck exhaust until a €235 million restoration began in 1999. Moncalieri Castle, where Princess Maria Clotilde once took her morning chocolate, is today an army cavalry school, though the ballroom still smells faintly of beeswax and orange blossom. Farther south, the House of Savoy's maritime gateway, Savona's mosaic-lined harbor, passed to the Ligurian Port Authority, but you can still see the crowned anchor insignia on an abandoned customs house. The cultural holdings were even more eclectic. The so-called Bembine tablet, a bronze relief of Egyptian Roman mystery cult origin purchased by Cardinal Bembo in the Renaissance and later acquired by the Savoys, today rests in Turin's Egyptian Museum, the second largest of its kind, after Cairo's. In 2006, The Guardian reported a behind-the-scenes tussle when Prince Vittorio Emanuele asked whether the museum might loan the piece for his son's wedding reception. The board declined. UNESCO stepped in to remind both parties that the object belongs to humanity. Then there are the jewels. Imagine a necklace of 110 Burmese rubies that once wrapped around Queen Marie José's collarbones, a diamond riviere so clear it seems wet in the vault light, a sapphire tiara hammered by Parisian jeweler Musi Padre Figli in 1883 for Queen Margherita. When the Constitutional Court granted the Italian state ownership of the crown jewels in 1948, officials sealed them in 4 iron chests and shoved the chests into a Bank of Italy basement in Rome. Only in 2000 did a team of Sotheby's appraisers, escorted by 2 Carabinieri colonels, lift the lids, gasp, and tally an insurance value that Reuters later pegged at $334,000,2021. That number eclipses even the Whitney collection of impressionists that settled into New York's Upper East Side. Unlike the Vanderbilts, who famously scattered their railroad billions by trying to outcastle European dukes in Newport, the Savoys did not squander. Their estates were seized. Yet the family's heirs continue to fight a legal guerrilla war over restitution. In 2012, an Italian civil court acknowledged the dynasty's moral right to certain apartments within Turin's Palazzo Chiablese, though not ownership. Prince Emanuele Filiberto, the tattoo-armed grandson who once tangoed on Italy's Dancing with the Stars, likes to tell reporters, "We are not beggars. We only want a fair share of the memory." Financial columnist Alessandra Migliaccio compared the standoff to Washington's Mellon Trust lawsuits over impressionist paintings, a tug-of-war between private bloodlines and public patrimony. Victor Amadeus II's secret French betrayal. Late December 1702, Turin lay under iron skies and the frost pinched like a tax collector. Lanterns hissed under the arcades of the ducal palace, while Duke Victor Amadeus II sat alone at a cedar desk, sealing wax cooling on his signet. In his gloved hand, he weighed a single sheet covered in ciphered numerals. Identical marks lived only in Prince Eugene's field chest on the Danube and in Count von Ratislaw's office in Vienna. By the time the candle surrendered to its own smoke, the Duke had signed a promise written first in invisible ink and then in his angular hand. France would never see this line. Savoy would trade the Sun King's velvet embrace for the Habsburg eagle's colder, surer protection. That midnight oath, later pieced together from charred fragments in the Haushof und Staatsarchiv, shifted the entire front line of the War of the Spanish Succession. Until that war erupted in 1701, Victor Amadeus looked every inch the Bourbon cousin. Born in 1666 and raised under the steely regency of his mother, Marie Jeanne Baptiste of Nemours, he learned early that a small Alpine duchy survived only by reading the temperature of larger courts. He married Louis XIV's niece, Anne-Marie d'Orléans. He sent his daughter Maria Adelaide to Versailles, where she charmed courtiers and would later give France a baby king, Louis XV. The armies of Savoy drilled to French cadence calls, and Turin's silk merchants thrived under privileged access to Parisian fashions. On paper, the House of Savoy was a satellite of the sun, yet the Duke read ledgers more closely than pedigrees. English bullion, Dutch credit, and Habsburg desperation flooded Europe the moment Charles II of Spain died without an heir. Allied treasuries dangled subsidies that could triple Savoy's revenue overnight if only Victor Amadeus would resist French expansion. Louis XIV, by contrast, demanded soldiers, fortresses, and complete obedience while paying in compliments. Worse, French troops already garrisoned Pinerolo and Casale. Savoyard strongholds turned into shackles. When Louis's minister, the Marquis de Chamillard, hinted that refusal meant outright annexation, the Duke's decision settled into silence. Savoy's court became a quiet beehive of secret intelligence. A Genoese cartographer, once arrested in Paris for drawing a caricature of Louis's thinning hairline, now drafted clandestine maps in the palace attic. Gondoliers on Savoy's payroll eavesdropped in Venetian taverns. A former Jesuit in London embedded scandal between psalm verses written in lemon juice. 48 field listeners appear in surviving payroll slips, evidence of Europe's earliest proto-intelligence agency, described by Oxford's Christopher Stores as a miniature Bletchley Park with better wine. French pressure tightened. The Paris market shut its gates to Savoyard silk, plunging Turin's merchants into panic comparable to a 21st century semiconductor embargo. Louis instructed Marshal Villeroy to mass 30,000 troops along the Alps and ordered Vauban to study Turin's star walls for weaknesses. Confronted with demands he could never satisfy, Victor Amadeus stepped onto a narrow plank: betray early, betray clean, or lose everything. Covert talks began through Prince Eugene of Savoy, a cousin who had broken with Louis and risen to command Habsburg forces. Eugene's courier, bundled as a Tyrolean falcon seller, crossed the Mont-Cenis Pass carrying 2 live birds and a third carved of rolled parchment sealed inside a bronze claw. General Pietro Badoglio's diary adds another layer, noting that on the day a pivotal decree was issued, the king privately assured the army it would not be called to intervene. When these fragments are pieced together, the trail of breadcrumbs becomes a blazing path, illuminating a partnership far deeper than the public ever suspected. Could such a conspiracy remain hidden forever? In the short term, perhaps. In the long term, never. Mellon's shell companies eventually faced Senate scrutiny, and the Umayyads' tribal stipends gave way to Abbasid banners. The king's silence held only as long as Mussolini needed the monarchy's veneer of legitimacy. Once that need faded, Italy stood exposed, its democratic institutions dismantled, its fate bound to a dictatorship. Within the palace, conversations dwindled to hushed murmurs. Foreign journalists, sensing collusion, grasped for evidence they could not yet find. The Vatican, preoccupied with negotiating new concordats, turned a blind eye. Anglo-American newspapers, some swayed by publishers enamored of Mussolini's anti-communist bravado, trumpeted headlines of "order restored," while ignoring the strangled cries of democracy. Hearst's outlets, in particular, echoed fascist claims of efficient trains and economic revival, glossing over the shattered printing presses and broken bodies of union leaders. The dance of wealthy elites cozying up to strong men was as old as power itself, and it played out with familiar grace. After Mussolini's swearing in, black-shirted emissaries roamed the palace halls, their presence a stark contrast to the powdered wigs of centuries past. Royal composers wove Savoy anthems with the martial rhythms of fascist drums, a musical metaphor for the uneasy alliance. Victor Emmanuel, retreating to his private study, lost himself in his coin collection, a monarch who could catalog rare denarii with scholarly precision, but could not stem the flood of decrees pouring from Mussolini's desk. The Acerbo Law of 1923, which handed 2/3 of parliamentary seats to the largest party, cemented fascist control. Press censorship silenced socialist editors, while the secret police expanded from a shadowy closet into a sprawling nationwide network. A foreign diplomat, observing the king's diminished role, remarked dryly that Victor Emmanuel had become the wax seal under which Mussolini files his edicts. Even when Mussolini declared himself dictator in 1925, the king signed the enabling laws without protest. Constitutional powers allowed him to dismiss the prime minister, but the bargain struck in 1922 had trapped him. To unravel it now would expose his initial misjudgment and risk the very civil war he had sought to avoid. The chessboard had shifted. The crown, once a commanding piece, was now hemmed in, its moves dictated by the momentum of fascist ambition, Amadeus VIII's anti-pope ambitions. Late in the 1430s, torches flickered down steep alpine passes, while hoofbeats hammered the frozen earth, every rhythmic thud announcing fresh intelligence for the most unpredictable enterprise in Europe. Amadeus VIII, graying yet still broad-shouldered, stalked the great hall of his castle in Chambéry, cloak sweeping flagstones polished smooth by generations of dukes. 40 years of rule had taught him patience, but this night his stride betrayed impatience almost too raw to hide. He had bargained with French kings, sent embassies to the Holy Roman Emperor, married his children into fortunes, and coaxed tax revenues from merchants on both sides of Mont Blanc. Now he wanted something no Savoyard prince had ever dared reach for: the keys of St. Peter. The project did not begin as a mad impulse. Amadeus read the currents swirling between Rome and the Council of Basel with the eye of a chess player who counts moves ahead. Pope Eugene IV, raised from Venice's crowded Colli to the throne of Peter, had entered a knife fight with the Council Fathers. They argued that a general council outranked any single pope. He answered that such thinking cut the sinews of papal authority. Threats and counter-threats flew across Europe like winter crows. When Eugene tried to dissolve the gathering, the bishops simply ignored him, elected their own officials, and looked for a champion who could give their cause iron muscle. Savoy's duke, rich, pious, and militarily positioned to menace northern Italy, looked very much like that champion. Courtiers recorded the first whispers in code. One minor canon in Basel jotted a crescent-shaped mark, his personal symbol for plan in motion, beside Amadeus's name in the council's seating chart. A Savoyard herald wrote to his brother that certain elders here speak of our Lord as a lamp set upon a high place, meant to guide all Christendom. Neither dared spell out the obvious. The bishops were grooming the duke for the papacy, or at least for a papacy-shaped cudgel to swing at Eugene IV. Candle smoke hangs in the cathedral air, muffling the murmured Latin as Father Luigi Guarini slides an unfamiliar name into the baptismal register, Maria Rosa Guerrieri. His pen trembles. The child's mother, Rosa Vercellana, stands near the font in a heavy cloak, eyes lowered, while two palace footmen hover just out of sight. No trumpets, no royal seal, only a whispered instruction from the private secretary of Crown Prince Victor Emmanuel of Savoy. Write nothing that points to the king. The priest obeys, then tucks the parchment behind a stack of parish tax receipts, praying the ink will fade before anyone with a keen political eye comes prying. That single entry, half buried among receipts for wax and wine, will haunt archivists for the next century and a half. Most Italians learn in school that Victor Emmanuel II, the future father of the fatherland, had two children with a country girl they called La Bella Rosin, Vittoria and Emanuele Alberto, both acknowledged and eventually ennobled. But Maria Rosa slipped through the cracks of statecraft. Her birth landed at the worst possible moment. Europe ablaze with revolutions. Queen Maria Adelaide, heavily pregnant with a legitimate heir, and Pope Pius IX railing against Piedmont's moral corruption. A fresh royal scandal would have derailed the delicate alliances Camillo Cavour was forging in Paris and London. Victor Emmanuel's advisors dusted off a time-tested recipe for royal indiscretion: conceal, rename, relocate. Rodrigo Borgia had done it by dubbing his son Cesare a nephew. Henry Flagler would try it later by tucking his love child into a Jacksonville boarding house. For Savoy, the formula began with a surname, Guerrieri, plucked from Rosa Vercellana's maternal line, and ended with a covert guardianship arrangement on the country estate of General Alessandro de Launay. Royal accountants funneled upkeep funds through dummy grape purchase invoices at the king's Barolo vineyard, Fontana Fredda, labeling each payment Rosa Bianca so parliamentary auditors would see only wine. Turin's cafes buzzed anyway. Il Fischietto, the city's cheeky satirical weekly, sketched Victor Emmanuel as a bore in love, tusks wrapped in pink ribbon. Pamphlets accused the prince of lowering a throne not yet built. But the midwife's bill, 40 scudi for a March delivery, never surfaced, and the baby's crib was rolled into the shadows of Launay's manor. Rosa visited when she could, leaving the king to comfort her with promises that the child would be safe until the world calms down. The world never calmed down. By June 1859, artillery thundered across Lombardy, and the prince, now king, was busy turning ragged militias into a national army. He rode at Solferino, shook hands with Napoleon III, and signed papers that made Tuscany, Parma, and Modena part of a newborn Italy. Meanwhile, Maria Rosa, dark-haired and sharp-eyed, watched from the lattice of a side chapel each Sunday, neither servant nor lady, tutored by a retired artillery captain hired to teach her geography. Anything to widen a life deliberately kept narrow. Queen Maria Adelaide died in 1855, and many at court expected Victor Emmanuel to legitimize Rosa Vercellana's elder daughter at last. Instead, he hesitated. Cavour wanted the monarch to appear respectable to Queen Victoria's ministers while courting British support in Crimea. Even after French troops helped Italy claim Lombardy, French newspapers snarled at the king's provincial mistress. The child remained hidden, her name confined to a tiny ledger entry that state housekeeping clerks circled year after year, while issuing her guardian a stipend, 200 lire, every spring, per His Majesty's directive. A decade later, October 1869, Victor Emmanuel married his lifelong companion in a quiet chapel on the San Rosore estate. The bride wore gray silk, aware the ceremony, morganatic by law, would not make her Italy's queen. Father Gioacchino Leone recorded that the couple lit 4 candles, one for every child they had brought into the world together. Names were not spoken aloud, but those present counted the flames. Vittoria, Emanuele Alberto, Maria Rosa, and a rumored infant, lost in 1853. The marriage proved the monarch's devotion, yet did nothing to free his secret daughter from anonymity. The old habit of silence had dug in too deep. In 1870, the capital shifted to Rome, and Europe turned its gaze toward the Eternal City. The Times of London sent a correspondent who wrote a snarky line in November. Italian gossip insists His Majesty enjoys the company of a daughter almost grown, born long before any church blessing. The palace ignored the quip. Troops were busy marching through the breach of Porta Pia, and the king had states to weld. Maria Rosa, 17, was meanwhile preparing for a clandestine journey to Alessandria, where a notary arranged her wedding to Lorenzo Baroni, a junior railway engineer entrusted with laying track on the Genoa branch of the new national network. The dowry, again 200 lire, traveled in a plain leather pouch, no crest, no seal. When Rosa Vercellana visited Fontana Freda in the summers, she slipped away to Alessandria to see her firstborn. Letters preserved at the University of Pavia reveal code names: Our Lily for Maria Rosa, the Dove for Lorenzo, and the Little Rails for their children. The first grandchild arrived in 1873, christened Carlo, and the king's household bookkeeper logged an unexplained payment for school shoes, size tiny. Victor Emmanuel never met the boy. He was too busy quelling southern revolts, debating colonial ventures in Eritrea, and warding off garlicky jokes from Paris about his wine-soaked court. The king died in 1878. Rome wept, radicals jeered, and the Pantheon acquired a new tomb marked Padre della Patria. His widow, still barred from queenly honors, wept at the funeral, but skipped the Berlin Congress where Bismarck toasted Italy's future. Maria Rosa, now a mother of 2, stayed home teaching piano in a rented parlor lit by kerosene lamps. State archives fell quiet, dust settling on ledgers no clerk dared throw away. Silence endured until 2018, when a Sunday supplement of La Stampa ran a quirky headline, "The First King's Forgotten Daughter." Reporter Sylvia Varani had stumbled upon a ledger note from April 1863, 200 lire for MRG, while researching court caterers. Historians leaped at the initials. MRG matched Maria Rosa Guerrieri's baptism. Wine geeks joined the hunt, combing Fontana Freda's 1960s balance books and spotting dozens of payments flagged Rosa Bianca. Slow Food's archivist suggested the code referred not to white rose grapes, but to a white rose child. The story trickled into blogs, then Wikipedia, then YouTube explainers that racked up 500,000 views in a week. By 2021, the genealogy site Dynasty Detectives uploaded a bombshell graphic. Mitochondrial DNA snippets from 2 living Italians, both tracing maternal ancestry to Alessandria, matched markers once cataloged in the bloodline of Queen Margherita of Savoy, Victor Emmanuel's legitimate granddaughter. The odds, the site claimed, were 1 in 110 million that the match was coincidence. Newspapers pounced. Corriere della Sera called it the riddle that rewrites our royal family tree. Skeptics pointed out that Margherita's mitochondrial line could, in theory, echo farther back through forgotten cousins, but the momentum was unstoppable. Social media turned wild. The hashtag #King's Secret Daughter trended on what was once Twitter. Amateur sleuths downloaded Turin's digitized parish scans, crowd-translating Latin scribbles in 30-second TikTok bursts. Some misread the priest's note, Patre ignoto per ordine superiore, as proof of a mafia link. Others claimed Maria Rosa had sailed to Argentina and founded a tango dynasty. Italian cultural officials, besieged by requests, released higher-resolution images of the March 1850 baptism register, plus a fragile midwife's receipt bearing a royal watermark. RAI smelled drama. In 2024, the broadcaster greenlit a 6-episode historical series, La Figlia Segreta del Rey. Screenwriter Elisa Gentile described the pitch on the podcast History and Chinotto. It's Downton Abbey meets the Borgias, set during the Risorgimento. Early teasers show Rosa bribing a midwife to flee Turin at dawn, and a grown Maria Rosa confronting palace agents in a railway station waiting room while steam clouds swallow their whispered threats. Some historians gripe about liberties. DNA tests happened decades earlier on screen, but the very existence of primetime drama proves how deeply Italy wants the secret aired. Genealogists now debate exhuming minor Savoy graves. Italian law makes royal digs a bureaucratic labyrinth. The Ministry of Cultural Heritage must sign off, the Archdiocese must bless, and living descendants must approve. Yet precedents exist. Spain tested Ana de Mendoza's rumored child in 2007. France opened Valois coffins in 2015. If Italian labs match bone samples to Maria Rosa's living line, a footnote graduates to branch status, and Fontana Fredda may start bottling a Cuvée Maria Rosa instead of the Koi Mirafiora. Umberto Vecchi's assassination conspiracy. The summer night is still warm in Monza, the soft Lombard air smelling of hay and engine oil, an uneasy mix of old-world harvest and new-century industry. A brass band is wheezing through a Sousa march in the palace courtyard, and King Umberto I of Italy, silver beard glinting under the incandescent lamps, raises a gloved hand to salute the municipal fire brigade. 3 bursts of applause crackle from the crowd. A 4th crack does not belong to any pair of hands. It is the pop of a cheap 5-shot revolver, dull against the music, yet sharp enough to slice through royalty. The first bullet nicks the king's collarbone. The second punches into his aorta. The third is fired almost for punctuation. Umberto falls sideways, eyes wide in the same startled disbelief that greeted his army's humiliation at Adwa 4 years earlier. 20 minutes later, on the silk cushions of an open carriage, Italy's second monarch is pronounced dead. Anarchist weaver Gaetano Bresci, short, sharp-featured, recently arrived from Paterson, New Jersey, accepts arrest with the calm of a man who thinks he has just tightened a loose bolt in history's machine. That much every schoolbook agrees on. The arrest, the trial, the photograph of Bresci framed against a stucco wall, guarded by carabinieri in plumed shakos, the whispered blessing delivered by a trembling priest who cannot decide whether to absolve a regicide. But almost from the moment the king's body cooled, a second, seamier story began to flicker through cafes and newspaper back pages. The notion that Bresci was not acting alone, that someone inside the grand drafty House of Savoy quietly unlocked a door that night. One Milanese broadsheet even hinted that high personages, stung by colonial disasters, preferred the monarch's silence to his stubbornness. Officialdom pounced, confiscating the issue before noon. The prefect of police declared the rumor bare volcanic fantasy, yet copies circulated on tabloid chains, folded inside opera programs, smuggled across borders inside bales of French silk. Within days, foreign correspondents were filing telegrams to London and New York, asking a single conspiratorial question: was the king's murder an inside job? The backdrop to that suspicion is a ledger of disappointment written in blood and beans. Under Umberto's watch, Italian troops pushed into Eritrea and Somalia, only to be routed in 1896 at Adwa by Ethiopian forces whose victory, according to historian Raymond Jonas, killed 7,000 Italians in a single morning and kneecapped Rome's imperial ambitions for a generation. Newspapers that once printed flattering caricatures of the Re Galantuomo, the gentleman king, now sketched him in pith helmet and clown shoes. At home, the lira sagged, grain prices spiked, and the factory workers of Milan and Turin struck harder than the bronze hammers on their clock towers. When General Fiorenzo Bava Beccaris answered a 1898 bread riot with artillery, killing perhaps 100 civilians, Umberto issued a telegram praising the general's wise and courageous conduct. The message made the king sound at best aloof, at worst complicit. Socialist Deputy Filippo Turati spat on the chamber floor and cried, "Every cannon round echoes in Monza." A year later, the king's motorcade would echo with gunfire of its own. Into that fever walked Bresci, 31, mustached and battle-scarred by American sweatshop politics. In Paterson, he had co-founded the newspaper La Question Sociale, railing against capital monarchy and, most personally, the Bava Beccaris massacre. When a whip-thin courier handed him a photograph of Milanese orphans picking through rubble, Bresci is said to have slammed his fist on the linotype case and sworn an oath. The New York Times archive for May 11th, 1900, quotes him telling co-workers, "I go to strike a blow that will awake the sleepers." He sailed steerage to Naples under a false name, spent a week in Tuscany visiting family, and arrived in Monza on July 27th. Italian police later found an English-language pamphlet in his valise, titled Regicide, as social anesthesia, one of those dime-store anarchist screeds printed in Chicago basements that smelled of ink and lathe oil. The detective who cataloged the evidence, Inspector Guido Bonaventura, wrote that Bresci's copy was thumb-worn and annotated in a neat hand. In the margins beside a passage praising Charlotte Corday, Bresci had penciled one word, necessario. So far, the story plays like a lone wolf tragedy, and yet skepticism lingered, fueled by three oddities. First, Bresci entered the royal reviewing stand area with uncanny ease. Guards later insisted they had not seen his revolver, though coronation protocols dictated frisking every civilian within pistol range. Second, multiple witnesses claimed an unidentified man in military tunic spoke briefly to Bresci near the palace gate before melting into the crowd. Third, and most tantalizing, a low-level court chamberlain named Carlo Allegri vanished the morning after the assassination, leaving behind an overcoat and an unpaid gambling debt to Banco di Milano. Allegri's sister testified that he had grown cold toward the king since the Abyssinian fiasco cost him a promised colonial post. Police dismissed her statement as hysteria. Within a week, the file was sealed under the label irrelevant. The Italian government at the time had reason to tidy things up. Prime Minister Giuseppe Sirocco feared that public knowledge of a court schism might ignite a Republican firestorm bigger than the Paris Commune. 2 days after the shooting, Sirocco's cabinet invoked emergency powers, empowering censors to spike any newspaper mention of court dissidents. The order mirrored the Tudor technique 3 centuries earlier, when Henry VIII's Privy Council sanitized the Anne Boleyn trial records to keep rumors of royal impotence from rotting the dynasty's image. In both cases, the stakes were existential. A monarchy cannot afford visible cracks. Politically, it was safer to blame an immigrant weaver than to acknowledge high-born saboteurs disgusted by colonial disaster and civil bloodshed. Parallel anecdotes from other dynasties create an eerie pattern. In 1881, whispers floated that members of Tsar Alexander II's own circle tipped off Narodnaya Volya bombers about his carriage route, partly as payback for the regime's limp response to anti-Jewish pogroms. The archivist Mikhail Kuchkin, writing for Novi Mir in 2019, calls the hints plausible but unprovable, noting entire crates of Okhrana files were shredded after the February Revolution. Across the Rhine, Kaiser Wilhelm I survived a pair of assassination attempts in 1878, both pinned on lone gunmen. Yet German historian Thomas Flanze unearthed Reichstag minutes in which rival Prussian nobles privately joked if only Hödel's aim were better, the liberals would spare us their speeches. Whether yes or evidence, the quip shows how easy it is for an embattled elite to fantasize about letting an outsider pull the trigger. The Bresci case fits that psychological template. Public rage outsourced to a fringe ideologue while respectable society wipes its hands. Victor Emmanuel III's secret fascist pact. In late October 1922, as dawn crept over the horizon, Rome trembled with a nervous energy that seemed to pulse through its ancient stones. The city awoke to a cacophony of half-verified rumors, each more alarming than the last, coursing through telephone exchanges like wildfire. Printing presses churned out newspapers, their ink barely dry before the headlines grew obsolete, overtaken by the relentless march of events. In the cafes lining the cobblestone streets, patrons gulped their espresso in haste, their hands too unsteady to savor the bitter warmth, their eyes darting toward the windows, as if expecting the world to shift at any moment. Beyond the city's heart, outside the Quirinal Palace, the royal guard stood rigid, their ceremonial plumes meticulously aligned, clinging to the pretense that tradition still governed the day. Yet even they could not ignore the distant rumble, their helmets tilting subtly toward the roads, where 25,000 black shirts trudged southward in ragged columns. Their boots kicked up clouds of dust that lingered over Rome's suburbs, thick and ominous, like the haze of gunpowder before a battle. Inside the palace, King Victor Emmanuel III paced behind tall, draped windows, his small frame taut with tension, despite the immaculate tailoring of his uniform, designed to exude calm authority. His mustache, clipped with precision, framed a face etched with indecision. Clutched in his hand was a memorandum, its edges faintly scorched, where frantic courtiers had tried to hasten its drying. No bold red stamp screamed urgent, but the document's weight was undeniable. It warned that Italy teetered on the brink of fracturing into warring city-states, a collapse that could unfold within hours if the king failed to act decisively. The words seemed to burn as fiercely as the singed paper itself, a silent plea for a choice that could either save or doom the nation. In the antechamber, cabinet ministers gathered in a tense knot, their voices low but sharp, each man jostling to sway the monarch's resolve. Some pleaded for a state of siege, urging the king to unleash the full might of the military, artillery barrages, sealed railway lines, anything to halt the fascist columns before they could breach the ancient Aurelian walls encircling Rome. Others, more cautious or perhaps more cynical, argued that the army would hesitate to fire on fellow Italians, especially those cloaked in the tricolor sashes of patriotism, chanting Viva l'Italia with fervent zeal. The king listened to the cacophony of advice, his expression unreadable, then dismissed the ministers with a curt wave. Alone, he summoned his aide-de-camp, hesitated, summoned him again, and finally reached for the telephone, his hand steadying as if the act itself could anchor him. On the other end of the line waited Benito Mussolini, 39 years old, his jaw set like carved stone, poised in Milan, for either a triumphant ascent or a swift arrest. With a few measured words, Victor Emmanuel extended an invitation to form a government. No fanfare heralded the moment, no public proclamation echoed through the streets, just two men exchanging polite phrases that veiled a shadowy bargain. The monarchy would retain its throne, the fascists would seize the reins of power, and if civil war was averted, both could claim a hollow victory. History books often paint the king as a passive figure, a timid bystander who merely affixed his seal to an inevitable fascist takeover. Yet the private records of the time, telegraphs, hastily scribbled notes, and marginalia scrawled in violet ink, tell a far more intricate story, one of calculated partnership rather than capitulation. A draft decree from October 30th, 1922, bears the king's slanted handwriting, the phrase necessary but temporary, written with a clarity that now reads as tragically naive, given that Mussolini's grip on Italy would endure for over 2 decades. This was no impulsive surrender, but a deliberate alignment, a gamble akin to a syndicate of seasoned gamblers pooling their stakes to control the table. The secrecy of this arrangement was no accident. For half a century, the House of Savoy had cultivated an image of regal impartiality, a monarchy soaring above the sordid fray of politics, as pristine as the snow capping the Alps. To maintain this facade of neutrality, every move had to be cloaked in discretion. Just as William Randolph Hearst's media empire once downplayed its owner's flirtations with authoritarian ideologies, the Italian court orchestrated a masterful sleight of hand. Official communiques spoke only of ceremonial duties, troop inspections, charity balls, visits to hospitals where the king blessed ailing soldiers. No newspaper dared publish the truth that in the dead of night, king and fascist leader pored over the same war map, their silhouettes flickering against the walls of a dimly lit palace chamber. Yet even the most carefully concealed schemes leave traces. Across Italy, provincial governors began to parrot fascist rhetoric, their speeches suddenly brimming with calls for national renewal. Army promotions tilted toward officers who valued iron discipline over the messy debates of Parliament. The pattern was subtle but unmistakable, mirroring the quiet patronage of Andrew Mellon's funding of loyal candidates in America, or the Umayyad caliph's strategic stipends to secure the allegiance of distant tribes. Whether through money, favors, or titles, the currency varied, but the goal remained the same: to weave an invisible web of influence that ensured visible dominance. Italy in 1922 was a nation battered and bleeding. The Great War had left scars on its land and its people, while post-war inflation gnawed at what little stability remained. Socialists occupied factories, peasants seized farmland, and fascist squadristi roamed the countryside, crushing strikes with fists and clubs. Governments rose and fell in a matter of weeks, sometimes days, their authority as fleeting as morning mist. Prime Minister Luigi Facta, desperate to stem the tide, implored the king to sign a decree declaring a state of siege, a last-ditch effort to block Mussolini's march on Rome. But the generals, wary of the army's loyalty, cautioned that soldiers might refuse to shoot their countrymen. Worse still, they hinted at a graver risk. If the military splintered, the monarchy itself could crumble. Faced with two catastrophic paths, a descent into civil war or a risky alliance with the fascists, Victor Emmanuel chose the latter, convinced he could leash the wolf once it had devoured the radicals, threatening his throne. This secret fascist pact was not a single document, but a series of tacit agreements, a chain of nods and winks stretching across weeks. Confidential files, marked Riservatissimo, outlined the terms of this delicate understanding. Mussolini would temper his revolutionary fervor, and in return, the king would cloak him in the legitimacy of constitutional authority. Ever the pragmatist, Mussolini agreed. In the earliest cabinet meetings, he performed loyalty with theatrical flair, bowing deeply to the crown as photographers captured the scene, a black-shirted revolutionary kneeling before the ancient monarchy. The images splashed across newspapers soothed the fears of conservative elites. Yet behind the staged harmony, real power was shifting. Orders began to flow not from the ministries, but from fascist headquarters on Via Rasella, and authority slipped from the palace as quietly as sand draining from a cracked hourglass. Mussolini's private letters to Margherita Sarfatti, his lover and image shaper, offer tantalizing glimpses of this arrangement. References to VE appear alongside phrases like our shared horizon, suggesting a mutual vision, however temporary. Royal decrees appointing fascist prefects bear timestamps that align with uncanny precision, as if king and deuce were exchanging a carefully choreographed dance of paperwork. General Pietro Badoglio's diary adds another layer, noting that on the day a pivotal decree was issued, the king privately assured the army it would not be called to intervene. When these fragments are pieced together, the trail of breadcrumbs becomes a blazing path, illuminating a partnership far deeper than the public ever suspected. Could such a conspiracy remain hidden forever? In the short term, perhaps. In the long term, never. Mellon's shell companies eventually faced Senate scrutiny, and the Umayyads' tribal stipends gave way to Abbasid banners. The king's silence held only as long as Mussolini needed the monarchy's veneer of legitimacy. Once that need faded, Italy stood exposed, its democratic institutions dismantled, its fate bound to a dictatorship. Within the palace, conversations dwindled to hushed murmurs. Foreign journalists, sensing collusion, grasped for evidence they could not yet find. The Vatican, preoccupied with negotiating new concordats, turned a blind eye. Anglo-American newspapers, some swayed by publishers enamored of Mussolini's anti-communist bravado, trumpeted headlines of "order restored," while ignoring the strangled cries of democracy. Hearst's outlets, in particular, echoed fascist claims of efficient trains and economic revival, glossing over the shattered printing presses and broken bodies of union leaders. The dance of wealthy elites cozying up to strongmen was as old as power itself, and it played out with familiar grace. After Mussolini's swearing in, black-shirted emissaries roamed the palace halls, their presence a stark contrast to the powdered wigs of centuries past. Royal composers wove Savoy anthems with the martial rhythms of fascist drums, a musical metaphor for the uneasy alliance. Victor Emmanuel, retreating to his private study, lost himself in his coin collection, a monarch who could catalog rare denarii with scholarly precision, but could not stem the flood of decrees pouring from Mussolini's desk. The Acerbo Law of 1923, which handed 2/3 of parliamentary seats to the largest party, cemented fascist control. Press censorship silenced socialist editors, while the secret police expanded from a shadowy closet into a sprawling nationwide network. A foreign diplomat, observing the king's diminished role, remarked dryly that Victor Emmanuel had become the wax seal under which Mussolini files his edicts. Even when Mussolini declared himself dictator in 1925, the king signed the enabling laws without protest. Constitutional powers allowed him to dismiss the prime minister, but the bargain struck in 1922 had trapped him. To unravel it now would expose his initial misjudgment and risk the very civil war he had sought to avoid. The chessboard had shifted. The crown, once a commanding piece, was now hemmed in, its moves dictated by the momentum of fascist ambition, Amadeus VIII's anti-pope ambitions. Late in the 1430s, torches flickered down steep alpine passes, while hoofbeats hammered the frozen earth, every rhythmic thud announcing fresh intelligence for the most unpredictable enterprise in Europe. Amadeus VIII, graying yet still broad-shouldered, stalked the great hall of his castle in Chambéry, cloak sweeping flagstones polished smooth by generations of dukes. 40 years of rule had taught him patience, but this night his stride betrayed impatience almost too raw to hide. He had bargained with French kings, sent embassies to the Holy Roman Emperor, married his children into fortunes, and coaxed tax revenues from merchants on both sides of Mont Blanc. Now he wanted something no Savoyard prince had ever dared reach for: the keys of St. Peter. The project did not begin as a mad impulse. Amadeus read the currents swirling between Rome and the Council of Basel with the eye of a chess player who counts moves ahead. Pope Eugene IV, raised from Venice's crowded collie to the throne of Peter, had entered a knife fight with the Council Fathers. They argued that a general council outranked any single pope. He answered that such thinking cut the sinews of papal authority. Threats and counter-threats flew across Europe like winter crows. When Eugene tried to dissolve the gathering, the bishops simply ignored him, elected their own officials, and looked for a champion who could give their cause iron muscle. Savoy's duke, rich, pious, and militarily positioned to menace northern Italy, looked very much like that champion. Courtiers recorded the first whispers in code. One minor canon in Basel jotted a crescent-shaped mark, his personal symbol for plan in motion, beside Amadeus's name in the council's seating chart. A Savoyard herald wrote to his brother that certain elders here speak of our Lord as a lamp set upon a high place, meant to guide all Christendom. Neither dared spell out the obvious. The bishops were grooming the duke for the papacy, or at least for a papacy-shaped cudgel to swing at Eugene IV. Alpine nobles warmed instantly to the scheme. They owed Amadeus estate rents, military service, and more important, personal loyalty forged in border skirmishes against France and Milan. Support the Duke and Savoy might leap overnight from principality to global arbiter of souls. Refuse him and risk ruin if he succeeded without them. So grain poured south from Sion, crossbows traveled west from Thonon, and stables along Lake Geneva filled with destriers suitable for a coronation cavalcade. Financiers in Lyon who had once eyed Savoyard credit with skepticism suddenly offered generous loans, confident any man bold enough to dispute Rome would find ways to repay. In October 1439, the Council Fathers stopped hinting and acted. Choirs thundered a Te Deum beneath soaring vaults. Incense churned upward like storm clouds, and a roll of drums announced that Amadeus VIII had accepted election as Pope Felix IV. Observers swore the ground itself vibrated when the Duke exchanged his fur-lined ducal bonnet for the triple-tiered tiara. The council's scribes wrote so fast that quills snapped against parchment. Outside, messengers leapt onto fresh horses and launched across the continent, racing rival couriers from Eugene IV with contradictory orders for every bishop, abbot, and secular prince in Europe. Publicly, the new pontiff radiated certitude. Privately, he lay awake calculating what open war with Rome might cost in blood and coin. He trusted his barons, but knew even the stoutest hill fort cannot withstand endless siege. Savoy's gold mines produce steady revenue, yet a pontificate at odds with half of Christendom devours more than any treasury can comfortably supply. Felix V therefore practiced a diplomacy as intricate as Milanese lace, threading promises to the Holy Roman Emperor, Burgundy, and certain German princes who disliked Venetian influence. When honeyed words failed, he let Alpine geography speak for him. Trade routes that fed Italian markets passed through his passes, and any town that sided too loudly with Eugene risked tariff shocks or closed roads until attitudes improved. Eugene IV countered with veteran cunning. He courted the French monarchy, arguing that papal unity would keep England off balance in the dying phase of the Hundred Years' War. He reminded Spanish rulers preparing the final Reconquista offensive that a divided church weakened crusading zeal. He dangled cardinals' hats before ambitious prelates and peppered universities with bulls affirming orthodox teaching. By the mid-1440s, the tide edged his way. Paris scholars who once praised conciliar supremacy began writing memoranda about the need for a single uncontested pope. Envoys who had trailed through Savoy's corridors, waiting for audiences, quietly packed their trunks and steered south toward Rome. Amadeus felt the shift in every bow that lingered a heartbeat too short, every ambassador who asked for clarification of Savoyard policy before committing troops. His treasury master delivered budgets that grew thinner, even as bills for lances and grain climbed higher. One ledger shows a sudden spike in payments to Italian mercenaries, then a notation in cramped script, funds postponed by His Holiness until further revenues mature. The velvet glove confidence of 1439 hardened into the steel gauntlet tension of 1446. Yet the Duke refused to surrender a dream he had nurtured so carefully. To wavering allies, he spoke with a zeal that made them straighten their shoulders against second-hand conviction. He quoted St. Maurice, martyr soldier of the Theban legion, whose relics lay in a Savoyard abbey, arguing that true leadership sometimes demands a crown of thorns. He reminded listeners that the Western schism of the previous century ended only when rival popes resigned. Rome, he claimed, must now return the favor. He promised conciliar reform, stricter oversight of church finances, relief from simony, a fresh crusade against the Ottomans advancing through the Balkans. Every letter closed with the sign manual, Felix Fae, Pontifex et Servus Servorum Dei, a signature at once audacious and pleading. Opponents scoffed that Felix held power only so long as his barons stood ready to fight. They were not entirely wrong. Castles ringing the Rhone stalked quarrels and pitch, and watchmen paced walls scanning for papal banners. But for each watchman sharpening a spear, a priest whispered to his flock that obedience to Eugene better safeguarded souls. Village by village, the moral high ground narrowed. The flashpoint arrived in 1447. Eugene IV, gravely ill, nevertheless orchestrated a series of diplomatic feints that isolated Basel and undercut Savoy. He persuaded the new Holy Roman Emperor, Frederick III, that God's favor, and, more practically, papal coronation, awaited only full recognition of Rome's line. He sweet-talked Milanese dukes by promising to mediate territorial disputes with Venice. Even merchants of Florence, once cool toward papal requests, accepted lucrative curial contracts in exchange for loyalty. Felix's chessboard shrank until every square seemed attacked twice over. Financial strain soon matched geopolitical pressure. Mercenaries marched on coin, not faith. Envoys demanded wine, audiences, and coins. Copyists who produced papal bulls needed parchment imported from Barcelona, and parchment cost coins. Felix's chamberlains pawed through reserve chests and found echoes where clangs should have been. He mortgaged estates, levied new tolls on bridge crossings, and ordered emergency melting of ducal silver plate. The ledger sum still staggered short of requests. Word of Rome's ascendance touched even remote valleys. One anonymous letter preserved in a Savoyard archive captures the mood. His Grace speaks of Rome as a fortress. He no longer believes he can storm. Hope curdled into resignation, and resignation looked suspiciously like failure. Amadeus had always prized dignity. He commissioned illuminated genealogies tracing Savoy back to Charlemagne. So public humiliation grated like sand in an unhealed wound. Thus he sought an exit that looked less like defeat and more like providence. In April 1449, cardinals loyal to Basel gathered in Lausanne's cathedral as organ pipes rolled thunder through the nave. Felix Feff entered wearing pontifical gloves embroidered with pearls, though observers noted dark circles under his eyes. He spoke without tremor, proclaiming that Christian unity outweighed any personal honor. Therefore, he relinquished the tiara to pave the way for peace. The statement was transcribed on vellum in a precise chancery script, sealed and dispatched to Rome. Listeners knelt. Some wept at the apparent holiness of the gesture. Later commentators, crueler or merely clearer-eyed, called the speech political failure disguised as humility. In Rome, Eugene IV had already died, replaced by Nicholas V, a learned humanist eager to heal schism. Nicholas accepted Felix's resignation gracefully, and, in a gesture both magnanimous and practical, appointed the former anti-pope cardinal bishop of Sabina. Amadeus returned to Savoy, where he built a lakeside retreat at Ripaille, planted orchards, and sponsored contemplative communities. Chroniclers in his pay emphasized prayers, almsgiving, and the serene beauty of his funeral procession in 1451. They downplayed the decade during which Europe's allegiance seesawed across the Alps. Plombières agreements, secret annexation deal, July 1858. Steam engines hiss outside the spa town of Plombières-les-Bains, while fans churn heavy air inside a shuttered dining room. Camillo Benso, Count of Cavour, Piedmont Sardinia's restless prime minister, leans forward, jacket unbuttoned, face glistening with the effort of compressing years of ambition into a handful of sentences. Across the small linen-draped table sits Emperor Napoleon III of France, fingers drumming a silent march on polished wood, mutton chop whiskers framing a half-smile that flickers between curiosity and calculation. Their aides have been dismissed. Only a groaning sideboard of half-finished trout and 3 bottles of champagne bear witness to a conversation about redrawing Europe. Cavour starts without pleasantries. He wants Austria evicted from northern Italy. He wants Lombardy and Venetia free. He wants the long-imagined kingdom of Italy made real before rival patriots or cautious monarchs can dilute the dream. He speaks of railways already laid, of Piedmont's modernized artillery, of soldiers drilling on the plains outside Turin. Yet he admits bluntly that Piedmont cannot face Vienna alone. French intervention, men, guns, and the swagger of an empire must break the Habsburg line. He offers glory for France, a strategic blow against an old enemy, and the promise that history will paint Napoleon III as the liberator of a peninsula that once educated Europe's artists, architects, and popes. Napoleon listens, twirling a cigar that never quite reaches his lips. His eyes roam past Cavour's words to the Alps, to the Duchy of Savoy tucked against France's eastern frontier. Savoy's passes, he muses, have forever been tempting as stone-ribbed ramparts that could cushion France from invasion. Officially, Savoy remains the cradle of the House of Savoy and a cherished piece of Piedmont Sardinia's identity. Unofficially, French strategists label it the missing jigsaw piece that would seal the frontier. Napoleon sets down his cigar and names his price. French armies will march beside Piedmont's troops, but Savoy must slip into the tricolor's embrace once victory is certain. Cavour does not flinch, though in his diaries he will later confess to a flutter of guilt. He believes unification outweighs sentiment. If shaving Savoy from the map buys freedom for millions of Italians, the exchange is acceptable. Besides, he assumes, many Savoyards speak French, trade with Lyon and Grenoble, and might accept Parisian rule if the alternative is permanent Austrian dominance in Lombardy. The moral algebra balances, at least on Cavour's reckoning. They negotiate details the way gamblers pass chips, brisk, economical, wary of sudden noise. French corps numbers, deployment timelines, and indemnities glide across the table in quiet bursts. Only when both men agree on the final clause, Savoy's annexation, do they lower their voices to whispers. The room falls so silent that the fizz of champagne is audible. Napoleon proposes an immediate written memorandum, but Cavour shakes his head. Paper trails invite leaks. The annexation must stay invisible until cannons and parades make objection futile. They settle on coded language and understanding, never to be spelled out in any communiqué, released to parliaments or newspapers. Secrecy is hardly novel to either man. Cavour, an avid student of English history, recalls how Stuart pretenders once accepted French subsidies in exile, trading political favors for coin under a blanket of mutually beneficial silence. Napoleon, whose own coup d'etat in 1851 survived because wires were cut and editorial offices occupied before sunrise, needs no lesson on hush. The two statesmen share a shrug that says secrets are the oil that keeps grand machinery from grinding in public view. They sign a sanitized summary, soon known as the Plombiers' Agreement, omitting the annexation clause entirely, then destroy the drafts that mention Savoy by name. By nightfall, couriers ride in opposite directions. Cavour's envoy races through mountain passes toward Turin, carrying instructions for King Victor Emmanuel II written in a cipher of reverse syllables. Napoleon's messenger heads to Paris, where Foreign Minister Walewski will slide a plain envelope into a private drawer marked Réservé. One note inside that drawer, later cataloged in a digital archive tagged Web 12 by modern historians, reads, "Question Savoy, to be handled only upon completion of operations. Avoid premature disclosure. Regional sentiment volatile." The phrasing is clinical, but the implication, territorial transfer cloaked until safe to reveal, could hardly be starker. Cavour spends the autumn baiting Austria, confident now that French bayonets lurk in reserve. He orders troop movements close enough to the border to look provocative, yet claims they are routine exercises. His government funds patriotic newspapers in Lombardy that trumpet Piedmontese solidarity and French friendship while denouncing Austrian taxation. In Vienna, the aged Emperor Franz Joseph fumes but hesitates. He suspects Napoleon III will intervene if war breaks, yet diplomatic reports are ambiguous. No explicit treaty of alliance appears in the French press. The absence of clear proof lulls him toward miscalculation. Spring 1859 delivers the spark. Austrian ultimata, Piedmontese defiance, and then mobilization. Napoleon rides south with 80,000 men. French trains rattle over freshly upgraded rails through Lyon toward the Italian frontier. The campaign is bloody and swift. Magenta, June 4th. Austrian forces collapse under combined Franco-Piedmontese assaults. Solferino, June 24th. 30,000 casualties in a single day force Vienna to retreat across the Mincio River. Europe's newsrooms explode with sketches of tricolor and Savoyard cross flags flying side by side in victory. Yet none of those sketches mention that one flag is about to vanish from Savoy forever. Behind the front lines, French staff officers draft provisional maps that already shade Savoy in the pale blue reserved for imperial provinces. Word seeps into headquarters canteens. but generals instruct subordinates to treat the rumor as tavern gossip. Private soldiers joke about Alpine wine, soon becoming a domestic vintage. Savoyard volunteers serving in Piedmontese regiments hear the whispers and wonder if they will return home to foreign customs posts. Still, the official silence, reinforced by letters Cavour circulates that stress no changes to Savoy's status are contemplated, smothers organized protest. Peace negotiations at Villafranca in July grant Piedmont Lombardy. Venetia remains under Austrian control, but the momentum toward Italian unification feels irreversible. Cavour resigns in frustration over the partial settlement, but returns to office within months when he calculates unfinished business requires his hand. Meanwhile, Paris begins choreographing Savoy's reunion with France. The euphemism is deliberate. Reunion implies historical rectitude rather than conquest. French agents commission pamphlets stressing medieval ties between Savoy and the Crown of France. Priests in Annecy and Chambéry receive quiet promises of subsidies for charity schools if they preach moderation. Early 1860 brings the plebiscite. Ballot boxes arrive under gendarmes' guard. Posters exhort voters to choose prosperity with France. Turnout soars. Official tallies exceed 99% in favor of annexation. Opponents later claim intimidation. Soldiers posted near polling stations. Merchants warned of license problems. But by then, the result rolls across Europe like a thunderclap. Savoy, cradle of the dynasty that still sits on Turin's throne, has slipped west. Critics scramble to locate documentary proof of the bargain, convinced such an about-face must rest on written promises. They find only whispers. Both French and Piedmontese archives release sanitized communiques citing understandings and historic affinities. The missing clause becomes the stuff of pamphlets, conspiracy, and furious editorials in British newspapers wary of French expansion. Yet the truth is exactly where Cavour and Napoleon III hid it, buried in private correspondence, coded diaries, and diplomatic registers shielded by classification stamps that decree silence for decades. Comparisons sprout in lecture halls. Historians line the Plombières deal beside clandestine funding the Stuarts received from France during their exile, a monarch trading sovereign prerogatives for survival while pretending to uphold national honor. They juxtapose Savoy's quiet transfer with Fred Brickell's land speculations in the postbellum American South, where front companies masked who really pocketed choice riverfront acreage. They connect Cavour's handshake with Napoleon III to William C. Whitney's Navy kickbacks of the 1880s, in which modernization budgets spiraled secretly into political war chest. Each case is a mirror angled differently, reflecting how power brokers slide favors under the table while toasting reform in public.